Everyone, welcome to this session with JFrog. I'm excited for this session because JFrog graciously invited us to speak at SwampUp 2021, where we hosted this session on how Okta can help secure your apps, APIs, and infrastructure. Well, I'm happy to return the favor and invite JFrog to come and speak here at Developer Day. Now I'd like to introduce another Jeff, Jeff Fry, a Senior Technical Alliance Manager with JFrog. He will be looking at how you can shift left your DevSecOps strategy and validate the security of your REST API endpoints before releasing into production. This is very exciting because it will show how JFrog and Okta can work together to support your DevSecOps strategy and secure your APIs, like we'd all know and love. I'd like to now turn it over to Jeff to get us started. Thank you all for attending this session. Let's hop to it. Over to you, Jeff.
Great. Thanks, Jeff Taylor. Thanks for the introduction. So today I will talk to you about why and how you should have API access control validation in your software delivery process. This means testing your API access and permissions before they hit production, so you can identify vulnerabilities early in the process before it starts reaching your customers. Now I'll show you how you do this with Okta. But first, let's talk about JFrog. So at JFrog, we kind of see ourselves as organizing the software chaos that's your software delivery process. Your software delivery process probably involves multiple languages, development tools, development teams. You have QA teams involved, different types of infrastructure. So the JFrog platform is the central software delivery platform. It works with all the major cloud infrastructure and services. It also supports on-premise as well as hybrid scenarios. It's an enterprise product, so it supports enterprise scale, supporting multiple teams, thousands of developers. So it supports high availability, so it ensures that you're able to deliver software all the time. And it also has multi-region support, so if your enterprise is distributed across the world, you'll be able to share your software to those other organizations. It also has extensive integrations with partner tools and an integration framework that includes comprehensive REST APIs, allowing you to create your own integrations as well. So let's get into the JFrog platform and its components. So what we're looking at here is several components of the JFrog platform. The first one I'm going to talk about here is our JFrog pipelines. So this is our CI/CD process tool. What this does, it provides the automation for delivering your software. It orchestrates the software building. It can do testing. It can do deployment, as well as delivery. The next product that a lot of people are familiar with is our JFrog Artifactory product. This is the server that hosts your software packages, things like Go modules, maybe Java jar files, maybe like Docker images. So once you build your software, you package it up, and you deliver it to Artifactory, where Artifactory can serve it to maybe your customers or your development teams. Adding on to that is our X-Ray product, and this is our security product. So once you build your software package, then we can scan it for security vulnerabilities. Let's say you have a Docker image. We could identify security vulnerability in your Docker image and stop the software delivery process and not allow that software to be delivered to production. It can also notify to your security team. So if you want to send an event to, say, ServiceNow or something like PagerDuty, where your support teams need to act on it right away, we can do that as well. What X-Ray also does, it checks for license compliance. Particularly if you're using open source products or software, there are particular licenses that may not work well with your enterprise products, so you can restrict those. Now we move on to the release process of your software. So we have a couple of products here, a distribution and edge. So usually your software applications include multiple software packages. And so what we're able to do is put these in what's called a distribution package. We put all that software in one package. It's immutable. It's signed to ensure integrity of that software that's being delivered to your, like, say, warehouse or your store. And this is further facilitated with our JFrog Edge product, which is that server software that's in the store that can deliver, say, to your point of sale system. And then finally, we have our mission control and insight. So this is the management layer that's on our platform. This provides visibility into all Artifactory repositories, your pipelines, your X-ray, your distribution, everything that's going on. Also provides metrics, so you can understand the performance of your software delivery process. The JFrog platform runs on AWS, Azure, or Google as a SaaS product, or also self-managed in the cloud as well. And like I mentioned earlier, it can also be run on-premise and also support hybrid use cases where you need to run it on both. So let's talk about why validate APIs. Why do that? Finding bugs, that's obvious. You want to do that with all your software. But now what we're seeing with enterprise organizations is they're working towards an API-first development. So when they're working on their back-end systems, they're thinking about building these APIs ahead of time to support things like UIs, customer-facing UIs, UIs for customer service, maybe APIs for troubleshooting for your support staff. Maybe you also need management APIs for making changes to data in your system. What you can see is that you start building these APIs as part of this first API-first development, they become extensive, and you require lots of different permissions for different teams. Then you find you have multiple services that also have APIs. And so what you really need is something like Okta that provides central management of these permissions, of these groups, of these policies, as well as these API services. So next thing we're going to do is talk about how this might work with your software delivery pipeline. So this is an example of a software delivery pipeline where we're building some software. If we look over here on the left, we just have some code. It could be multiple applications. We'll pull the code into your CI/CD process. And then again, you can use a product like JFrog pipelines. First thing we're going to do is we're going to build that software. We may build a module. Maybe it's a Go module, so we'll build that. Then our X-ray product can come in and scan that module and identify any vulnerabilities in that software package. Next thing you want to do is if you're using, say, Docker or Kubernetes, you want to do a Docker build and create an image. So you create that image, and the X-ray product can again scan that image and identify any security vulnerabilities. Next up is once you have that Docker image, then you want to push it to, say, Artifactory, where Artifactory can host it. And then you want to pull it from Artifactory to deploy it. In this case, the first environment that we're talking about here is deploying to a development environment. And this could be where you want to first do your API validation. In a development environment, you may have your standalone API service there with some expected users and policies that control access to that API. So with OAuth or with OAuth Dev App created through your Okta API access management, you'll be able to test that there. So that would be the first test. Let's say that test passes. The next thing you want to do is promote it to your system test environment. So in this environment, you're going to have more complex API validation because you're going to have more API services within this environment. Not only will you have your API service that you've developed, but you may have others as well. And you may also have shared policies, users, and groups. So you need to validate these. You may make a change on your policy that can impact other API services. You can additionally create a system test app with an Okta to represent that. Now, if that passes, this is when you promote to production. So in production, this is where you can do further validation, maybe as a canary deployment. Say you deploy your application to production and you want to control, at least in the beginning, minimal access to your API service. So you have a limited set of users, you validate those, and if those are okay, then you open it up as part of that canary deployment to all users. So that's an example of what a software delivery process with API validation using Okta could look like. Now let's talk about the importance of this centralized access management, particularly through Okta. With this centralized access management, you're able to manage groups of users, devices, scopes, and policies all in one place, rather than trying to do it yourself or have it spread out across maybe configuration files or your own homegrown apps. With it centrally managed, you also can easily compare scopes and policies that you create across your applications. And that allows you to manage multiple application API services across multiple environments. And then you can actually compare the configurations. Say you have an issue in your system testing environment, and then you say you validate it successfully in the dev environment. Well, then you can make the comparison of those policies and rules, see where the issue lies. Next thing we're going to talk about is real quick, just an overview of the data model that we're using here in Okta. So when you get your Okta instance, you can get a free developer instance. You're given an org, and this represents, say, your company. On that org, you're going to have a directory, and this handles all your users. So you can have not only your users, but groups of users. And so this may be an instance where you have maybe a customer support team, maybe a engineering team, and you want to have special permissions for those. Next up, you have your application, and so this represents your API services application. Then you have your policy, and this helps you manage access to your applications and APIs. You can restrict access based on certain conditions like users or groups or devices or locations. As part of this policy, you're going to have scopes, allows you to create different types of access. And then also you can have rules to determine how to process any sort of authorization requests that come in. And you can base those rules on the type of scope or even the type of user. And then lastly, what you have is an authorization server. And this is the server that actually protects your API endpoints by checking authorization based on tokens that you hand out to your users or other applications. So now that you have the data model, let's talk about the process for authenticating and authorizing your APIs. So what happens is when you have a client that wants to access your API, the first thing you need to do is authenticate that client. So you can authenticate them here with a username and password to the authentication server. And then if it's valid, the authentication server will return a session token. And that session token proves that the user is valid, and it's a temporary validation. Next thing that needs to happen is that client needs to exchange that session token with the authorization server for our API service to get an access token. And then with that access token, we can start making requests to our API server. So then that access token is included as an authorization header in our request to our API. Our API server will make a check on that access token and whether the user can access the API. And that's done through our authorization server. And if that's successful, then you'll get a response back from the API. All right, so let's take a look at how that will look in code. So in this example that I'll show you a little bit later when we run our pipeline and build our application, we're building a Go application that's providing an API service. So let me jump right to my IDE and look at that code. So here we're looking at my IDE, and then we have a very simple Go app, starting off with the main.go. In our main function, we're setting up our API service based on some configuration here. So we pull some configuration. In this case, we're pulling it from environment variables. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we look at our Okta dashboard, but we have an audience parameter that we need to pass in, a client ID that we also need to pass in, and an issuer, which is actually our authorization server. That sets up the configuration for our API service to do the authentication. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this code. This sets up our APIs themselves. So it's, again, very simple. We have an API here for health Z, which just provides a health on the application. But the one that we'll be testing is this API v1/users. So if a GET request comes in for this API, we have a handler for that. And that handler is this validate API access. So let's jump over to my handlers, and that is this function right here. So this is just a very simple API. It's really just to check this authentication and authorization. So what will happen here is we will check the header of that request for that authorization token, along with some additional parameters. And then that ultimately will get called back to the authorization service to see if this person has access. If it doesn't, we'll respond back with a 401, you're not authorized for this request. Otherwise, we'll respond back with a 200 OK, and you are authorized for this request. So what is this isAuthenticated function? So let's take a look at this. So what this function does is it takes that request and pulls the authorization header. And then we'll pull from the authorization header the Java Web Token, and then we'll decode it and verify it through the authorization server to make sure that this user has access to this particular API. So this is an example of doing it with Go, but Okta also provides many other examples of doing it with other languages as well. Now, next thing we're going to do is take a look at how it's set up in our Okta console. So I am using a free developer instance of Okta. And the first thing I'm going to look at is the directory. And if you remember, this is where our users are set up. I'm not using any groups. I just have a couple users set up. The one we're going to validate is our test user. And so in this example, we're just going to validate that this user has access to our API service. I have this test user here. It's assigned to 2 applications. The one that we're going to be validating is this test app. That represents our API service. And then this is the client ID that we need to send when we do the validation. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you where the API access is configured. And it's under security here and API. So for our API service, we have an authorization server set up called test server. And in here, here's where we configure our scopes and then our access policies as well. And again, these are the rules for our access. And I'm just using the default rules right now, which only validates that a user has access to our API service in general. You could come up with more sophisticated rules, but this is the simple one we're using for our demo. All right, great. So next step is I'm going to show you how JFrog is set up to build this software, deploy it, and test it, and test the APIs. So let me pull up my JFrog platform, go ahead and log in. So like I mentioned earlier, we're pretty well known for our Artifactory product. This is what hosts your software packages, and this kind of gives you a view of some of the more popular packages that you can easily serve with Artifactory. In here, we have a packages view. I currently have just one Docker image, and this is actually the image for the application that we're going to build. I've already built it once, so it's sitting here. And in the artifacts view, this shows the various repositories where you can host your images. And so I'm hosting it here in this workshop Docker. Next thing is the X-Ray product. With X-Ray, we can set up security policies, and I have one set up here for Docker scanning. So any Docker image that's posted to Artifactory, we'll scan it. I'm only identifying or notifying high severity issues. And just to see an example of that, I'll jump over to packages, and I'll click on this Docker image. You can see here I've built several versions already. I'll click on that version. And this X-Ray data tab here shows the vulnerabilities that exist in this Docker image. Ordinarily, what you would do is if you find a vulnerability, you would stop your software process. You'd notify someone, maybe the developer, and they would fix this. But for the purposes of this demo, we'll just go ahead and let it run so we can deliver the software. And then lastly, we have our JFrog pipelines. And so, again, this is responsible for automating our software delivery process. It's a CI/CD tool. And just to kind of get a visual representation of what that software delivery process would look like, we build a Docker image here, we do a push, we publish some build info, we promote the build, and then ultimately we can deploy it. And we'll run this in just a second. We'll go into more detail of what's happening. As part of our software pipeline, we also have integrations with other tools that's required to build our software. So, like I mentioned, Artifactory is responsible for serving our software packages, so we have an integration with our Artifactory. For this particular application, we're deploying it to Amazon EKS. So this requires some integrations with AWS and EKS, that's Kubernetes. So we have credentials stored here. We also have credentials stored for GitHub because we're pulling our code down from GitHub in order to do the build. And then there's some environment variables that we're storing that's going to be used, our Okta environment variables that are being stored to be used with our software validation. So that gives a quick overview of the JFrog platform. Now let's talk about how we're going to build this Go application with a pipeline and test it. So let's take a look at the pipeline that we're going to be running. So JFrog Pipelines defines the software delivery pipelines in a YAML file, in YAML format. And so this is the actual pipeline itself. So now if I go down and jump to this pipeline section, so JFrog Pipelines define pipelines based as steps. So the first step you'll see here is a Docker build step. And so this will take that Go code along with a Docker file and build that Docker image. And the Docker file it's referring to is this one right here. And this is just a pretty simple Docker file. It's using a Golang image. It's pulling down, it's pulling your Go mod and Go sum files. It's pulling in the dependencies, and it's copying the source code over, and it's doing the Go build. Pretty straightforward there. If we go back and look at the pipeline, the next step is once we build that image, we're going to do a push. So we're going to push that image to a repository on our Artifactory instance. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to publish build info. And so what build info is, it's the metadata involved in the build process. So this would be the dependencies that are involved, maybe some environment variables or any other parameters used in the build. We consider this a bill of materials, and what this does, it provides some good traceability if you encounter any issues or you need it for an investigation later on. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to promote the build to another different repository, and then we're going to do our X-ray scan on it as well. And then finally, our last step here is we're going to deploy our application. We're going to deploy that image into our EKS or Kubernetes cluster using a deployment file. And then we're going to wait for our application to come up. And then we're going to go ahead and make an API validation call using a particular user, using that test user. The deployment file itself is pretty straightforward, just a Kubernetes deployment file. And we have just a deployment resource. We deploy this container. We pass in some environment variables used for authentication here. And then we have a service that's set up as a load balancer type. So what that will do will give us a public IP address so we can access our application. And then in our pipeline, I mentioned that we have this call here. This will validate, again, our API and see what that one looks like. It's just a bash script. So if I scroll up here, I'm going to pass in some Okta parameters here, like the org server or the authorization server, the client ID, the test user and its password, and the API that we're trying to call. First thing we're going to do is we're going to authenticate based on the username and password. If you remember, then what should happen is I'll get a session token. Once I get that session token, then I will pass it to the authorization server for our API service. When that's successful, we'll get back an access token. You see that here. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and make a curl call to that API that we want to validate using that access token. So now if everything's all good, if it's authenticated and we can access that API, we should get status code 200. Otherwise, it'll fail. Like in the case of this user doesn't have access to that API, we would get a 401, we would fail this. So with that, let's go ahead and execute it. And now watch what's going on here. So let me go back to JFrog platform. We'll go back to my pipelines. I'll click on that pipeline. And again, this pipeline is defined in YAML, so this is just another way to view it. So now that I have the visualization here, I can take a look again at the YAML and see everything that's going to execute. And then what I can do is execute this manually. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this button here. And that will execute a pipeline. So the way JFrog pipelines works, it works off of build nodes. And so when you want to build your software, do any sort of testing or sort of deployment, this is all handled by build nodes and contained within a node pool. This particular instance of our JFrog platform is running on AWS. So these build nodes are actually EC2 instances. So if I click over here, and we can see that we have a dynamic node pool, and we have it set to a maximum of 5. Right now, what's happened is that we've spun up an EC2 instance to process this software build. It's provisioned. It's about to be in use. So that's what we're waiting for right now. So we're just waiting for that node right now. So the other thing I'll point out too is I executed this manually, but when you have this GitHub integration, anytime you make code changes and then you do a commit, this JFrog pipeline will automatically pick up that commit. Also, you can do the same thing with a pull request. And then go ahead and pull that code down and then go ahead and execute the pipeline automatically. So while we're waiting for this node to execute, I will click on this active run. And so what you can see here, you can see those pipeline steps that I went over earlier. Right now they're waiting to execute once we acquire that build node. Once those execute, you can click on each of these and you will get real-time updates on the execution of this particular step. So right now you can see right here, we're waiting for this node to start. And overall, this pipeline takes about 3 to 4 minutes. The build step is the longest one, so it's pulling down a lot of Docker layers and building that image. So once we get through this, so what's happening here now, what you're seeing is it's actually pulling down the GitHub repo. It's pulling down that code. And then just a second here, it'll start building that Docker image. And here you see the Docker build step. And again, it's using that Docker file. You can see that right here. So it's building a Docker image with this image name, okta.jfrog.io. The repository is workshop Docker. The image name itself is this workshop, okta-workshop.-app, with a tag name of 6. This happens to be the build 6 or run 6. So now you can see it's pulling down layers. And this will just be just a few more seconds. There we go. So it just finished up. It's cleaning up this step. Now we're moving on to the next step. So the next step is going to take that Docker image and push it to our Docker repository being hosted on our Artifactory instance here. So now I can move over to that step. Docker push. You can see the commands that are being executed here. That was using the JFrog CLI, which is another tool you can use to integrate with our platform. So it pushed that image to our repository. Next thing that's happening is it's publishing build info, and that one's just completed. Again, collecting the environment variables, other parameters and dependencies used in the build. We're promoting it next. We're running our X-ray scan. That's a pretty quick step. And then next thing we'll do, we'll be moving on to our deployment and test. And that will be the last step. There we go. So we should be executing this deployment in 1 second here. just kind of run through this. So these couple steps here is it's doing an AWS authentication. Next thing we're doing is we're updating that deployment file to include the new image build. Then we're applying that deployment file. This is being deployed into the namespace Okta workshop on this Amazon EKS cluster. As part of that deployment, you have a Kubernetes service. So this command here is waiting for that service to come up. And then once it comes up, we get the URL to our API service. And so now the next thing we're going to be working on here is validating that API. There we go. So let's go back here and take a look at what's happening when we validate that API. So we're using that test user. It's executing that bash script. So as we walk through this, we're doing the authentication first. Then what we're doing is we're getting the session token and the access token. And then here's where we get the access token. And then we make a request on that API with that access token. And you can see here we got a 200 response. So we authenticated that test user, made the call to this API, and they were valid to access the API. Now, if that user was not authorized to access this API, we would expect to get like a 401 here. And this step is successful, says we're deployed and tested successfully. And that is the end of our pipeline executed successfully. So that ends our demo. Let me jump back to the slides. So that finishes up most of our presentation. Just let you know all the code that I showed you today, the pipeline code, the Go code. That's all in my GitHub repo at jeffreyfry/okta-id.devsecops. And then the JFrog platform I use is a free instance on the cloud. You can get your own free instance at jfrog.com. And then with that, I'll hand it back over to Jeff Taylor for some closing remarks.
Thanks, Jeff, for that in-depth look at how Okta and JFrog can support our customers in creating more secure APIs for their applications and for their end users. I think it's like, as I discussed in my presentation, at SwampUp, transitioning monoliths into microservices or even starting with an API first strategy becomes important as you deal with the plethora of APIs that you're going to create, that you have a very systematic way of deploying those things securely to production. The other thing I appreciate is having a live demo to show that it's actually real. I think you guys remember in my presentation, I went through the same thing. And it's important to see that, like, putting all of these steps together, there's a number of decisions that have to be made that are going in to making this pipeline actually work and work in a way. And I love to see that Okta can help us do that. I think this is just a great window into what's possible with these two high-powered platforms working together. And to close this out, just a quick reminder, thank you all for attending this session with JFrog and how to shift your DevSecOps, to shift left the DevSecOps security strategy. I'd like just a reminder that Jeff's code is up on GitHub in the location that you see on the screen. You can sign up for a free JFrog account at jfrog.com. And also, if you want to build something similar to this demo or just extend in your own capabilities, you can also sign up for an account at developer.okta.com.